Let's continue our Illinois football season previews, position by position. We've wrapped up the offense and the special teams. Now, Joey Wagner, let us dive into the defense, which I think has more questions than the offense. I think we feel good about where the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and offensive line room are. We talked about the questions at tight end. But defense, after a disappointing dive after last year, we knew they were going to get worse on defense because you only have one place to go when you're the number one defense in the country. But they really slipped from number one in scoring defense to number 69, one of the worst scoring defenses in the Big Ten last year. So let's start it up front because we know that is where it all starts up front, and they've been pretty good up front the last couple of years, and they just lost a program legend in Johnny Newton. So this is where it starts, and if that secondary is going to improve, the defensive front has to improve. So let's break down the defensive line and outside linebackers because there's some intriguing talent here, but a lot of questions.
Yeah, it's funny. I have questions of production in the secondary, and I have questions of personnel up front on the Illinois defense. And you've got big shoes to fill, right? You lose Johnny Newton, you lose Keith Randolph. Don't sleep on losing Denzel Daxon. He was a really good nose guard, a position that they've developed well. And now you've got to find yet another, we think, in T.R. Edwards, and we'll get into that, 1 year kind of stopgap there at that position. There's a lot of new faces, and those guys are stepping into the conversation. This training camp has been, hey, remember, guys, you got to replace Johnny Newton. I'm sure they're sick and tired of it, to be honest with you. But it's a huge story, and it's one that's going to linger over until we either see that these guys can make that a average to slightly above average group or however far, or they underperform. And it's like, well, we knew the secondary 2023 where you knew you got to replace some big names, and it's just not happened in that way. And, we'll see where that goes. They have, Jeremy, though, brought in on the defensive line some intriguing talent with Dennis Briggs Jr., with General Hunt, and then the expectations of T.R. Edwards and Alex Bray.
Yeah, they had Anichi Sledge, the Auburn transfer as well. So let's focus first on the defensive line, which I feel like we need to set this up. Illinois runs a 3-man defensive line front. So they have a 3-man front, but
for now,
it basically looks like a 5-man front because they have the 2 outside linebackers. Now, Seth Coleman sometimes can drop back. I think it was like 25% of the time last year. He dropped back into coverage, but usually Gabe Jacas is going to stay on the line of scrimmage. So it's a versatile defense. Sometimes they ran a 4-man front. Sometimes they'll run different things where they only have 2 defensive linemen on the field. And that will be a storyline this year because we've been chatting about it. I think the best way to get your best 11 on the field would be 2 defensive line, 2 outside linebackers, 2 linebackers, with one of those guys being an overhang linebacker, which is kind of like an outside linebacker. But not to get too nitty gritty, but that discussion needs to be had. That I do think Illinois will do that a little bit more this year. But I still think the question is, when you have a 3-man defensive line front, do they have enough on the defensive line? Because you lost Johnny Newton and his 52 tackles, 43 pressures, 7.5 sacks. He had 7.5 of the 9.5 sacks of last year's defensive line, by the way, and 9 quarterback hurries.
In a million snaps.
Yes. And he played 85% of the snaps that he was available, maybe more if you take out that Wisconsin second half where he missed most of the fourth quarter, do that ridiculous penalty. Not ridiculous because it was probably the right call, but it's just I don't like the rule. But yeah, you have to replace a consensus All-American, a 2-time consensus All-American, a top 40 draft pick. Do they have enough? They certainly addressed this position, Joey. You can't say that they didn't because they added 3 transfers up front. But we've talked about it over and over again. Class of 2021, they only had 1 prep prospect, Seth McConnell. He's now gone after transferring to Boston College. Class of 2022, they didn't add any defensive linemen. So that's left this hole in the roster that they had to fill through the transfer portal is Dennis Briggs, General Hunt, Anichi Sledge, and the development of guys like Alex Bray, Jeremiah Warren, who are young, T.R. Edwards, moving Ezekiel Holmes to the defensive line. Did they do enough up front?
That's a good question. I mean, I don't know. Right? I feel bad saying that.
That's like the storyline we're going to figure out, like, right? That's
why they brought a lot of humans. They brought a number of humans to come in here and do it. And look, I think Dennis Briggs is a good football player. I think when he's been on the field, that has shown up in his production. The problem is he's been hurt at times in his college career. If that's the case again, then no, right? Like you bring in a guy with a little bit of an injury history, and if it pans out, you can get out of it healthy, and I can say, yeah, maybe they did do enough. But if those injury bugs come back, you say, well, maybe not, right? And they tried to go get Anthony Johnson. He got here, I think, realized Alex Bray was in front of him, left for Mississippi State, left again for Pitt. That's kind of a lot of moving there in a few months. So, I mean, they did address this position. So, I mean, I think in terms of players who can be in the 2 deep, yeah, there's enough guys. You're not going to have to rely on like Johnny Newton levels of snaps because you don't have enough ready to play guys. But are those guys productive enough to go in there and keep this afloat up front?
I think one way we got to look at this is Johnny Newton was one of the best defensive linemen in all of college football the last 2 years. But even with that, Joey, his defensive line was fine last year, right? I mean,
injuries played a role.
When you play about it, because Keith Randolph Jr. was not himself due to injuries. This defensive line last year had 73 pressures. That was down from 117 the year before. Of course, the secondary got worse, so that made their jobs a little bit harder to get to the quarterback. But again, they only had 9.5 sacks last year. They had 11 the year prior. And running defense was pretty good, I thought, for the most part throughout the season. But Randolph really slipped. He had 32 pressures in 2022 when he was healthy, 13 tackles for loss, 4.5 sacks. Last year, he had 13 pressures, 4 TFLs, and 1.5 sacks. So it was health, right? That was the reason he wasn't there, but that made a difference. Like, this was not a dominant defensive line, even though you had a dominant player in Johnny Newton, because Randolph also missed a few games. And while Bryce Barnes, I thought, was really solid, like, it's just not going to be a huge disruptor up front. So I do think like our bar is Johnny Newton, but as a whole, I thought this group was solid, good last year. I don't think it was a dominant group. When I did think in 2022, when they had a great secondary behind them, it was a more dominant group. So I think we think of replacing Johnny Newton, but as a whole, I don't think it's as scary to replace if you can stay healthy and if they hit on Dennis Briggs. Like, if Dennis Briggs, I think, can he be 2022 Keith Randolph? 32 pressures, 13 tackles for loss, 4.5 sacks. I think that's within his realm of possibility based on his previous production, based on what he has done since he's arrived at Illinois. If he's that, like, that's a huge piece to this defense. And then if Alex Bray can be more disruptive than what Keith Randolph was last year, maybe all of a sudden you have a pretty good defensive line, because I'm pretty confident they're going to be good at nose tackle, because that's just what Terrence Jamison has done with Roderick Perry, Calvin Avery, Denzel Jackson, and T.R. Edwards has proven he's at least a solid Big Ten nose tackle so far.
Yeah, I think your point is true. Like, replacing the line as a whole feels like a fairly attainable goal here, right? The thing that I struggle with when you're talking about Johnny Newton in particular, obviously the numbers are huge, but there were just those moments that he changed games. And like, that is where you can have on the aggregate a defensive line that has roughly the production as a year ago. I still don't think it'll even be that, because Johnny's production was so significant. But if you're missing those game-changing plays, those Johnny comes in the second half against Minnesota and sacks him on the first play, things like that, where it's like, yeah, there's not a lot of people in college football doing that. That's where you get a little scary, because if the secondary, which we'll get to tomorrow, Jeremy, if that's not forcing those game-changing plays and Johnny's up front to not do that, then you've got guys that we'll get to later in this pod on the outside that you're really going to lean heavily on doing that. So, yeah, I mean, long way of saying, like, they can, on the aggregate, be roughly where they were a year ago, I think. But, man, they need someone to go in there and flip a game on its head. And,
yeah.
like, can Dennis Briggs be that guy?
Well, here's where it comes for me. It's like, I think this becomes a more normal defensive line.
Sure. Yes. Like actual rotations.
Yeah, like actual interior defensive linemen, because we have been so spoiled the last couple of years watching an interior defensive lineman wreck games. I'm not saying he's going to be this in the NFL, but Johnny Newton was basically the Big Ten equivalent of Aaron Donald the last couple of years. And I think anyone who watches NFL football knows Aaron Donald is the exception, not the rule on the interior. Like most guys just do their job. They're tough. Every once in a while, they get a one-on-one battle and they win. Like Aaron Donald got double teams and triple teams and just still found a way to wreck games. Johnny Newton was the same way. So yeah, none of these guys I think is going to get the attention that Johnny Newton got. And none of these guys is going to single-handedly dominate a game like Johnny Newton. But that's typical defensive lines. I think of Iowa's defensive lines and their interior defensive linemen. You know, they had one guy a couple years ago, it was Davion Nixon, that could do it. But mostly it's the Joe Evanses of the world. It's Logan Lees of the world. They're just stout guys that usually win their battles. And sometimes they might make sacks. But what they do is they clog their gaps. They win these battles to allow everyone else to do their jobs. And that's why I think this group, they're not trying to be Johnny Newton. I did a story on this. They're trying to emulate Johnny, though, in his work ethic, his toughness, his relentlessness, because as talented as Johnny was, it was those other things that really made him special. Like he's got the athleticism, of course, but then also he worked as hard as anybody else. Like, and he was a leader, and he just had this incredible mentality. So they're trying to take that like blue collar mentality, which I think of when I think of like Iowa defensive lines, and do their job incredibly well. We can trust the development of Terrence Jamison. That gives me some optimism about this group. But that, hey, we don't have to be Johnny Newton, but we can act like him and kind of bring that mentality to the defensive line. So then maybe everybody else is better at their job, right? Like, so your outside linebackers and your linebackers and corners can make those game-changing plays. Not that they don't want the defensive linemen to do that when they have the opportunity, but I think that's my expectation for this group now is, okay, now they're going to look like a normal defensive line, not the All-American disruptor, but can they still do that well? We still have to see, because we still have to see Briggs and Bray and Edwards, and we'll get into some of these other depth chart guys, Ezekiel Holmes, Jeremiah Warren, like, can they do it? Anichi Sledge, General Hunt. Can these guys in the aggregate be a solid defensive line? This still got to be seen.
Yeah, you had the stats, right, of the defensive line, the pressures a year ago, and it wasn't
73 last year, 117 in 2022.
And Johnny was of that 73, remind me?
He had 43.
Okay. So that's exactly what we're saying, right? Like 73 pressures in the defensive line doesn't feel hard to find, right? I mean, over the course of guys you think are going to take that step. But listen, I think we've talked about that at length. Like we talked about Dennis Briggs, Alex Brays. You want to get into the X factor?
Yeah, let's go. Let's go with the X factor, because it certainly is Alex Bray. They're betting big on this guy, and it seemed like he beat out Anthony Johnson. Like I'd still feel more confident if Anthony Johnson were on the roster, just because Alex Bray, I think he's going to be a solid rotation player this year, and I think he's going to be very good in the long term for Illinois. But he's still just a 19-year-old, right? Going up against Big Ten teams, so they're betting big that he's going to make a sizable impact here.
Yeah, he must have shown them something over he traveled last year with them, you'll remember, which puts them kind of roughly in that 2 deep, 2.5 deep, however you want to look at it. That was valuable. He clearly had a good winter and spring. And then obviously into the summer, because we saw they were active in the portal post-spring at position. So if they felt like they truly needed to address that, they would have. And they addressed it with the addition of Gentle Hunt, but it still felt like they were rolling into fall with Alex Bray as their guy. He's a longer guy. He got a high motor, former wrestler, kind of all of those buzzwords that you hear about with that position, things you like at that position. He fits the bill. He's probably a little undersized right now because, as you mentioned, he's a 19-year-old sophomore in college, and you're asking a lot of him to go fight around with some Big Ten offensive linemen.
Yeah, so right now he's 6'4", 272, around there. He came to campus 255, so he's definitely added a lot of strength. And listen, I don't think he's small, but we're talking Big Ten defensive lineman here, right? So if he were 280, I'd feel a little bit better. And that is a question mark. Like I believe in the kid. Like it's just they are betting that he's going to be a good Big Ten starter this year, and he's played 32 snaps, so he's a question mark from the outside, but internally they're very high on him.
Yeah, I think if you want to find a reason for optimism, or I guess frame it a little bit differently, we've heard, I like your mug, we've heard with Terrence Jameson that like it's not a one size fits all teaching lesson on the defensive line. So Terrence Jameson right now needs to teach Alex Bray to use maybe some more of his quickness versus weight that he's going to have next year or the following year. Can he, like, he's a good teacher. Can he maximize that? Again, that's not unique. Like every coach kind of tailors their teaching tactics to what they have in front of them. But I don't think that he's going to say, well, this is what Keith Randolph did, and this is what you're going to do, Alex Bray. I think there's going to be a lot more nuance to it, and be able to maximize what he's able to do right now today, which probably is a little, you're not buying it.
No, I'm being careful of what I'm about to say. You know who else was undersized when they arrived on campus and whose position Alex Bray is playing? One Johnny Newton. Johnny's quicker. Johnny's a better athlete. But like he is filling big shoes because Briggs is basically playing the Randolph position in that 4-eye. Johnny plays the 4-eye too, but like Johnny's more of a natural 3 technique, but kind of playing a similar position, kind of going to play a similar role in that you think of Briggs as this stout, but also athletic and make plays. Bray's more of the quickness, disruptive guy. So they obviously are seeing things that they think he can play the role, even if it's not John. Like no one's going to hold him to that standard, but he kind of does fit the bill for that position. It's just this is his first real year of big time experience. So we'll see who else can play that role. It feels like Jeremiah Warren is behind him, and he really, really intrigues me as a long-term prospect. But I think a lot of how disruptive they are is going to depend on how good Alex Bray is, because we feel like we have an idea of what Dennis Briggs will be because he's played it at a high level. Now he gets more reps. Like it all translates on paper. It's just for us from the outside, it's a blank slate with Alex Bray, which makes him one of the most intriguing players on this entire Illinois starting group, right? Going into the season.
He might be the most intriguing player on defense right now.
Yeah.
I think we have a pretty good feeling of everyone else around him. So yeah, look, here it's a big bet. It is. And I understand if you're hearing this and think, well, didn't they bet on the secondary a year ago? Didn't they bet on right tackle? Yeah, like I understand where you would have some apprehension to get on board with that. And like we're not gonna know until probably Kansas, right? Or in that window. I don't know that Eastern Illinois is gonna give us the exact blueprint of how good Alex Bray will or won't be.
Right. The good news is,
but they believe in it, right? Like this isn't like you're betting because you struck out swinging everywhere you went. Like you're betting because you believe in what you see to bet on that, and they believe which has kind of been his story with Illinois, right? Like they believed in what they saw when they recruited him out of high school. He's not a very highly recruited guy. He did a really good story on him, and for not being highly recruited, he was highly productive. And they liked what they saw. They liked some of those tools, those buzzwords that we've talked about. I guess maybe we didn't think that would happen as quickly as it has. So I think it's probably a credit to him for making them bet on him, right? Playing well enough to make them bet on his talent.
Yeah. So I think the ideal version would be like Alex Bray is like the 4th guy, the rotation guy, plays 300 something snaps this year, but you had like a veteran starter who's just kind of a little bit more proven, and they kind of split reps. But I mean, if he beat out Anthony Johnson, that's encouraging because Anthony Johnson is pretty good recruiting had a bunch of Big Ten and SEC offers. Now he's bounced around in the last year pretty well. So it's been interesting to watch, but yeah, he's certainly one of the X factors of this group. The other guy I want to just add to this conversation is Ezekiel Holmes, because he kind of always looked like a defensive lineman playing outside linebacker, and now he's added some strength. Another 7th-year guy. He seems to be the top guy behind Dennis Briggs on that kind of 4-eye 5 technique role right by the offensive tackle. He's strong. He's big. He's long. He's experienced. So I just think he's a good rotation piece. And if Briggs were to have injury issues, Ezekiel Holmes is an impressive-looking guy with experience. I think could do a solid job in that rotation. So just an interesting position move that I thought made a lot of sense, and he's in the 2 deep right now. So just another name to know.
Yeah, it's probably been one that ideally maybe they make a year ago. I think his body type is kind of fit that mold. Yeah, I don't know. Like he was serviceable at times, but again, he kind of always looked like a defensive lineman playing outside linebacker. But we'll see what that looks like with him. I kind of lump him in with that Gentle Hunt, that Anichi Sledge, where kind of it looks like Hunt had production and Sledge and Holmes kind of looked the part. You just got to see it manifest. Like, I feel bad. Like, right, we're talking about this. I don't know that we have a lot of answers, which is kind of the story of the defensive line right now. Like, it's so much. Like, I know people are serious. Like, oh, we're supposed to wait and see. Yeah, I mean, I don't have a better answer. Like, we're going to try, obviously, right? But like, there is a lot of this position has a lot of wait and see to it, and maybe it'll work out. But to your point, that group behind Bray, behind Briggs, behind Edwards, that group fascinates me because I don't know exactly how that all plays out.
Yeah, it's weird because I do feel like they have more playable depth than they've had in recent years. Like that, I feel like their second string has a higher ceiling than the second string we've seen here recently.
I would agree. Let's break through last year's: Bryce Barnes, T-Rod Edwards,
and Seth McConnell.
Yeah.
Like, I thought Seth McConnell was a big X factor last year because it's kind of how I was feeling about what Alex Bray could potentially be this year, was that like, hey, he's a rotational role. We'll see if he can be one of the top starters the following year. But Bray's development is ahead of Seth McConnell, and Jameson recruited Bray, didn't recruit McConnell. But yeah, like he was kind of the intriguing guy. We didn't know what that ceiling was. It could be a Big Ten starter. Like, Bryce Barnes, solid rotation players, walk on, right? I think he got the most out of himself, and I thought he played decently well when he was in last year, but there's just a ceiling there. And Edwards was solid. McConnell, I didn't think had a great year. So I just feel like this group, maybe it's because of the unknown, but I just feel like there's more guys with a little higher ceilings than the previous couple of years.
Yeah, I think there's more guys, right? Like, we just named three. Like, I forgot about Seth McConnell, admittedly, which is on me. But now you're talking guys like Anichi Sledge, like Gentle Hunt, like Ezekiel Holmes, like possibly Jeremiah Warren. I don't know that I'm fully ready to throw Angelo McCollum in that mix yet, but he's an intriguing freshman. Like, if there was a freshman defensive lineman to play, I would think it would be him. But I feel like we kind of knew more about what Bryce Barnes was last year than we know about these second string guys now. We kind of knew more about what T-Rod Edwards was last year than we know about some of these second string guys now. But there are a number of guys who, like, Gentle Hunt's been productive. He's been a productive college football player. He's not the biggest guy, but Illinois clearly didn't care about that, and his production is there. Anichi Sledge is the biggest guy, but he's not been as productive. So, like, it's kind of a little bit of mix of what last year was, blended with maybe one or two more guys you think could go out there and give you meaningful snaps in a pinch.
I just feel better that, like, Jeremiah Warren's a guy that really intrigues me. He's got a year of experience, right? Like,
he traveled last year.
Yeah. So Sledge is a talent upgrade. Gentle Hunt has been productive. Like, there's just a little bit more there for me. All right, long-term prospect that really intrigues you. Go ahead.
I think it's Angelo McCollum right now. I know Demetrius John has moved to outside linebacker. I will believe that if I see him at outside linebacker next fall. But as of right now, it's McCollum. Another undersized guy, which probably held him back from getting more attention. He was a really productive kid in high school. He's quick, he's strong.
Dominant in high school.
Yeah, he's got a lot of tools that you like, except for the fact that he doesn't have the ideal size. But if you turn on the film, he looks really productive. He looks really good. He looks like he's got things that can disrupt games. Like, if you're expecting Alex Bray to be that guy to disrupt games right now, the next in line to me would probably be Angelo McCollum with more development. And that's intriguing because we've seen, obviously, as we've talked about for the better part of 15 minutes to start this, we saw what these disruptive defensive linemen can bring and can do and can kind of shape the narrative of the rest of the line. And McCollum looks like the guy who could be that, despite not being as big as some of those other guys.
Yeah, certainly a compact frame, but there's just those flashes of athleticism and, bend and power and speed to power. Like, he's got some of those things. So if he were 6'3", he would have been a 4-star prospect, but he's probably closer to 6 foot. But he's a really good prospect. The other guy I would mention is Demetrius John. Like he's moved outside linebacker because they need bodies for practice right now. And the scout team, that's my read on it, because this kid's big, he's long, he's kind of the Keith Randolph frame, and they're going to need more of those guys with Dennis Briggs and Ezekiel Holmes being gone next year. So I think McCollum's definitely going to be in the 2 deep in 2025. I think Demetrius John has a chance to. He's going to get a lot of reps in the spring. Like I don't love the move because I want him to get as many reps as possible. But I understand they do need some bodies there, and he's got some athleticism, played some edge in high school. So he still really intrigues me, but probably 2 years away from making a big impact, especially with this move to outside linebacker. And Eddie Turk is huge. 6'4", 325. Illinois is pretty deep at nose tackle right now. So I think he's probably on the 4th string behind Edwards, Sledge, and General Hunt. But he's massive. He's big enough to play center or guard, and he's got the potential to do that, play offensive line later too. So just a really impressive physical specimen and tough physical kid. All right, depth chart, Joey. I wrote it down at practice yesterday going through a rotation. Now, this isn't the end-all be-all, but it looks right. 1st string, Alex Bray, T-Rod Edwards at nose, Dennis Briggs Jr. 2nd team, Jeremiah Warren, Sledge, or Gentle Hunt at nose. One of those two. Ezekiel Holmes and on that 2nd team. And then 3rd team, Andrew McCollum. Hunt was kind of repping there, but I think him and Sledge are battling out at nose tackle. Then Pat Farrell, and then Eddie Turk is kind of your 4th nose tackle right there. So I think the most interesting battle right now is probably Sledge and Hunt at that nose tackle spot. Sledge is bigger. General Hunt is the senior, has been more productive. I think he's more disruptive. But otherwise, I think those are the 7 guys most likely to play, right? Bray, Edwards, Briggs, Warren, Sledge, Holmes, and Hunt.
Yeah, I think that's right. The only thing that's interesting with Hunt is I'm remembering like maybe there was a thought of some more versatility than just nose when they landed him, just because of some of the things that he does. I'm wondering if that's still on the table or if that's kind of sorted itself out in fall camp where you see that, hey, he's probably a nose here.
I was told he played between the guards. So maybe he could play the 2 technique, which is like basically right over the guard. 3 technique. I just, the length is not there. Like he's 5'11". Right. He's 5'11", so that puts him at a disadvantage. So he's not as stout as Sledge or even T-Rod. T-Rod's not the longest guy either, but he's longer than Hunt. But he can be really disruptive on the interior, and he's really strong. So, yeah, I think eventually he's going to play. He's going to play at that nose tackle spot, but he does have a little bit of versatility if you go to like a 4-man front.
Yeah, Sledge is a guy that I think we're going to be talking about at this time on this pod next year. With a year with Terrence Jamison, physically, he's really impressive. Mm-hmm. He is a really, really impressive man.
Yeah,
but I think he's raw.
Yeah, he needs a lot of time to develop, but it is encouraging that he seems to be competing for a 2 deep spot.
Yeah, and again, after a year with Terrence Jamison, I'm fascinated to see what that development looks like a year from now. But those are the main players, Jimmy. Pat Farrell's a guy Brett Bielema's mentioned here or there a few times. Still young. He's a redshirt freshman, as I'm remembering. Another guy that kind of similar to Barna. You bring him in, is he an outside linebacker? Is he a defensive lineman? He's obviously landed on the defensive line. Just maybe someone to monitor if there was going to be one guy to jump up and say, whoa, I didn't think a lot about him coming into this. He would be that, but I think the expectation for that's probably still on the back end.
Well, Farrell is built like a prototypical 3-4 defensive end. 6'5", 280, tough, physical. Just the development needs to happen. He did play kind of outside linebacker in high school, but he always had the frame. It was like, that guy's a defensive lineman. Like I'm not saying he'll be this guy because this guy was a really good player for Illinois back in like the Rose Bowl era, but Doug Pilcher, he's built like him, just big, physical, maybe a little athletically, not the quickest dude, but he looks like a Big Ten defensive end. All right, expectations for this group, Joey. I'm going to throw this out there. I think this is a group that you want to be competitive, tough, and let others do their jobs well, right? Like that's kind of how I think of this group. But every year under Brett Bielema, they have held opponents under 152 rushing yards per game and under 4 yards per carry. That's got to continue. Like you think of some of the years Illinois just got run over and he was allowing 200, 250 rushing yards per game. That can't happen. So running defense, I do expect them to be pretty solid to good. Bray's the question mark right there. How does he hold up in the Big Ten? I do think he'll be a better pass rusher. But again, like last year, the defensive line had 9.5 sacks. That's not a big number to replicate. So I think 10 sacks between all these guys is a very reasonable goal, especially if the defensive backfield can improve. So listen, Phil Steele had them 17th out of 18th in the Big Ten. I don't blame him for that because of the big question marks here. But if this group can just be middle of the pack defensive line in the Big Ten, or, 9 through 13, I'd feel okay if as long as I know the rest of the groups are going to get better.
Yeah, I would agree with that. This might be a dumb phrase, and you're going to tell me if it is, I hope. Can you just go from disruptive to productive? Like, just be steady.
Yes.
Don't try to
Bill Belichick style, right?
Yeah, it's got to be the message right now. I'm not saying we've heard that, but like that makes sense. Just take what you get, but don't feel like you've got to have 7.5 sacks to replace Johnny Newton. Just be productive in your role. This sounds like such coach speak, and I hate saying this, but I just think until things settle down, don't try to freak out and be a guy who sack hunts and then you leave someone, leave a gap open and then you've got problems. Just kind of understand what you're asked to do this year and know that Johnny Newtons don't come around very often, right? They just don't, at least at Illinois, and probably more broadly than that, just as disruptive as he was. Just be productive, be sound in what you do. And if you do that in the way that I think Terrence Jamison, we talk about X factor, it's him. He's so good at this. He could, if he hit the market today as a free agent coach, he would have a number of opportunities. Maybe not today with the cycle.
If there were a guy stolen from this staff to be an NFL assistant coach, it's Terrence Jamison.
Yes, it might be both of your guys in your trenches. I mean, I think they're both pretty well thought of. But yeah, I believe in his teaching. I believe in what he asked those guys to do. So that's the X factor for me. And I think he's earned the fact that, I think this group is going to be sound. What does sound look like? Is that middle of the pack Big Ten? In an 18-team league, is that 10? Maybe, just given what they have. But I think it'd be an
unbelievably successful year, right? Because
replace what you've replaced?
Yeah, I do think I don't think this is going to be a dominant group. I just don't. But I do think it can be a solid group, as you said. I do think there's a downside where what if Dennis Briggs gets hurt and Alex Bray isn't what they think, and T.Y. Edwards isn't quite as good as Denzel Jackson was last year? It could be a real weakness.
Then you're breathing pretty heavy, right?
Yeah, and if you don't have a defensive line in the Big Ten, good luck. It's just not going to happen. We've seen it for years. Lovie Smith did not have very good defensive lines. Finally got a couple guys that could make an impact through the portal and in high school recruiting that Brett Bielema got the most out of. But you don't have a good defensive line, or at least a stout one. That's why the rushing defense is the most important to me. For this group, maintaining that standard of what has been solid to really good run defense is the most important part out of this group. Yes, they have to get sacks at some point. They're going to get probably more one-on-one battles than the defensive lines got in the previous years because they're going to be more focused on the outside linebackers. So you still want to get some productive sack production there. But for me, holding up against the run is the most important thing.
Yeah, but Bielema talks about a lot, right? Run the ball, stop the run, and cover kicks. Covered this guy for 4 years. I've heard that 1,000 times at this point in my life. That kind of fits the bill of what you're asking this defensive front to do. And then we can get into it right now. It's a good segue. Then you hope your guys on the outside can make disruptive plays, can change the games with those plays, your Seth Colemans, your Gabe Jacas, your Alec Bryants.
All right, I want to take a minute to tell you about Home Field Apparel because they are the premium collegiate apparel brand, and they're based in nearby Indianapolis. Home Field sent me a few shirts, and what I love about them is, of course, they have incredibly comfortable, well-fitting shirts, but they also have officially licensed apparel with vintage college designs. And they have more than 180 plus available colleges, including, yes, your Illinois Fighting Illini. They have great gear for the upcoming football season, so for the warm weather games, check out their Script Illini t-shirt, the Orange Ringer tee, the vintage Oski Chihuahua helmet, or for the fall chillier games, check out the Script Illini hoodie, the Flying Illini hoodie, the Flying Illini quarter zip, and if they're still available, you might want to check out homefieldapparel.com for this. Check out their Script Bomber jacket. It is awesome. Also, don't miss their Can't Miss Kickoff 2024 campaign. So Homefield is giving away these special football boxes, and these platinum VIP boxes include 3 never-before-seen items from your school that are not available anywhere else. They're curated so fans have new gear to wear all season long, suitable for all weather conditions. And these platinum boxes also include other exclusive items, including a new hat or ringer, a VIP koozie, and a 2024 Platinum Pass, which guarantees 20% off and early access to your school's football releases through the 2024 season. The football boxes are available on August 9th, so these will sell out quick, so go check them out. Go to homefieldapparel.com to check out their great selection of Illini gear and use code Illini24, that's all capitals, Illini24, for 15% off. That's Illini24 for 15% off at homefieldapparel.com. All right, so let's dive into the outside linebackers, which for basically the entire Brett Bielema era has been a strength of the team, but it was pretty inconsistent last year. There were times where you didn't hear enough from Seth Coleman and Gabe Jacas and Alec Bryant. But towards the end of the season, I thought Gabe played some of his best ball, a little under the radar, but Seth Coleman dominated 6 sacks over the last 6 games, including 2 multi-sack games. We know what he did against Maryland. But can this group be great? That is the question. This is a good group, but for this defense to take a huge step forward after losing Johnny Newton, you need different disruptors, and it's got to be the guys on the edge. What I saw in the spring game was very encouraging because Seth Coleman and Gabe Jacas dominated, and what we've heard so far, Gabe has had a very strong training camp. You got a story coming out, Joey, about something they've added to the team and the defense that Gabe has been a big part of. So that's the big question. Can Seth Coleman be more consistent and be an all Big Ten second, third team performer? Can Gabe Jacas be the type of player and give the type of production that makes him a potential early entry NFL draft guy? Because he was kind of stagnant as a sophomore. So can this group be great? That's the storyline here, because for the defense to take a big step forward, they need great production out of the outside linebackers.
Yeah, within that, can Seth Coleman be more consistent? Can Gabe Jacas take the jump we thought he was going to take a year ago? If those two things happen, then yes. This can be a huge plus of your team and probably the most impactful, disruptive position group on the defense, is if that can happen. I don't think when we talk about those things, I don't think those are like out of the realm of very reasonable to do. Like Seth Coleman, when he is like, you look at, we talked about this earlier this offseason, right? In our returners on the pod, those final 6 games of Seth Coleman's season last year, he was disruptive and at times very dominant. When he had 6 sacks in those final 6 games, as I'm not mistaken it. Gabe Jacas,
but during the first 6, he had 0.
That's right.
He had 4 pressures? It was like, where is he?
That's what you've got to limit. And again, I've said this before, but he's unquestionably on NFL radars. And someone brought up to me, like, did they not see the first? Like, the consistency has been the story with him. If he can put all that together, he told me at media day that he and new outside linebackers coach Clint Centum have talked about that consistency and how to maintain that over the course of a year. And Gabe, it just like, and again, I think Seth can do that. I don't remember. I'd have to go back through. I should have done that before we had done this. Did he have a quiet 6-game stretch? And since he's been a regular rotation player, was that the quietest 6-game stretch of his collegiate career? By far. That at this point feels like the outlier, right? Those 6 games feel like the outlier for Seth Coleman.
And I will give him this. These teams took such big leads that they didn't have to throw the ball, right? Like Purdue had such a big lead. Kansas had such a big lead early on that they didn't throw the ball as much. But still, at some point, you have to go make some plays, and just didn't see that from these guys early in the season.
You didn't, and that's why I think Seth Coleman can find. Like, I don't think he's going to have a 6-game stretch like that again. I don't know that he's going to have a 3 or 4 game stretch like that again.
Yeah, and those 6 first games, by the way, just to put it out there, 4 pressures, 0 sacks. Last Last several games, 6 sacks. I think he had like 14 pressures.
Yeah, and it started with that Maryland game. He had a 3-set game at that Maryland game. So I don't have a lot of concern that he's going to have that first half again. And we have to point out, Seth Coleman has had, in this is 6th year, 5 position coaches, 4?
5.
5. Charlie Bowen, Clint Senham, Kevin Kane.
Austin Clark, Jimmy Lindsey.
Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot of change to deal with. So I think he'll be fine. I do. Is that going to be, we'll get into reasonable expectations with him and what that total could be. Then it just feels like it's time for Gabe Jacas. His freshman year was a ball of fire, right? Like kind of came out of nowhere. He obviously physically looked like it. And then he produced at such a high level in regards to how you would think a freshman would produce. And I think we all thought last season was it. And because it wasn't that insane jump into second team All Big Ten or third team All Big Ten territory, it was like, oh man, what happened to Gabe Jacas? And then you zoom out and look at his numbers, like, hey,
it's the same,
right? Yeah, for a sophomore in college, it's pretty good. That's pretty good.
His freshman year, 35 tackles, 5 TFLs, 4 sacks, 22 pressures. Last year, that was last year, sorry. 2022, he had 31 tackles, 4 TFLs, 4 sacks, 35 pressures. So more pressures, but basically the same tackle and sack production, but it was stagnant. It didn't get a ton worse, but it was like it didn't get better either. And I mean, he's got the size. He's a good athlete, obviously. He's so physical. But just talking to him the last several months, Joey, something different about him. Like I feel like he knows, like, now he didn't arrive as a freshman, and it's not easy. Like, and he got to see what Johnny Newton is now reaping his rewards. And he's like, I need that. I want that. And I saw how Johnny kind of approached his craft, how he led, and that I have to bring it all the time. So yeah, 57 pressures in 25 games is pretty good, but there's another level that he can reach. And seems like he has been hell-bent on getting that. So I've just loved what I've heard out of him and what we've heard of him throughout the last several months.
Yeah, it kind of gives me, when you talk about guys sounding different, gives me Luke Altmaier vibes.
Yeah,
offensively, just a guy who kind of knows where he's at, what the lay of the land is in college football, and how to maximize where he can go. I think you look at him, I mean, all the tools are there, right? I think obviously you want to limit him in coverage if you're going to drop an outside linebacker back. I'm not sure that that's your best approach, but Seth Coleman would be the guy, and just let Gabe go get the passer and stop the run. It wasn't Gabe. Option plays gave those backers a little bit of fits last year, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm curious how that looks, especially with Kansas coming up on the schedule. But I think Gabe Jacas, like that, those two guys, he and Seth Coleman, feel ready to make that jump. They do. They feel ready to be the faces of this Illinois defense.
They need to be all Big Ten players, like honorable mention, whatever. Like they have to be all Big Ten players for this defense to go. And NFL scouts are watching, man. We've seen NFL scouts at training camp. Who are they watching? Outside linebackers are the first stop. Offensive line is next. So that tells you where Illinois' talent really is right now. So those are the groups that they're looking at in positional drills for sure. I want to mention Alec Bryant. He's got a lot of experience, 555 snaps, solid PFF grades, like 69 PFF grades the last couple of years. Nice. Hasn't put up flashy stats, 38 tackles, 13 pressures, 6.5 tackles for the last 2 sacks. But he's been a solid rotation player. I think he's really good against the run. Not as good of a pass rusher as a guy like Seth Coleman, but he's physically imposing. He seems like he's just a really solid guy that they can rely on if Coleman or Jacas gets hurt or needs a breather. And keeping these guys fresh is going to be really important. So this guy's going to get like 300 snaps, Joe. And one of the guys that we shouldn't overlook because he's probably one of the most important rotational defensive players on the team.
Yeah, he's the guy who's earned Clint Senham's trust very quickly. He's a guy who can play both of those outside linebacker positions, we're told. So that versatility helps out a lot. So he's like kind of in the way Brandon Henderson's a backup at 4 spots. He's a backup at both of those outside linebacker spots for Illinois, at least the way we understand it. He's been really serviceable, really steady. I mean, they've talked in the past about feeling like they have 3 starters at outside linebacker, Coleman, Jacas, and Alec Bryant. But yeah, I mean, he is very important. And when you're talking that outside linebacker rotation, he's a guy who's going to have a big role in that. And you're going to see him play. I don't know what the expectations you would have for him now, but he's going to play a sneaky number of snaps for Illinois this season, because those guys are at their best when they're not gasping out there. They can turn it up and go get that quarterback. You're going to see a good deal of him.
Yeah, and probably a starter in 2025, right? So that's another guy that's going to be important for them the next couple of years. X Factor. I had Daniel Brown written down because the JUCO All-American is kind of this Swiss Army knife. He could play inside backer, that overhang linebacker, could play on the edge, and he was repping with the second string, but he's been limited by a back injury here recently. So I'm even going to I'm going to mix this up even further than you thought, Joey. I'm not going to go with the guy that I probably have for the next one. I think it's Clint Sinham.
Ooh.
Right? Because listen, I am a big fan personally of Charlie Bullen. He's an NFL outside linebackers coach, so he obviously knows what he's doing. I think he's a really good teacher, but just looking at the production, 2021 and 2022, Illinois averaged 78.5 pressures over those 2 years with Kevin Kane. Last year, obviously the defensive backs have something to do with it, right? 49 pressures for Illinois. Their pressure rate went from 21.8 in 21, 18.8 in 22 to 12.28% last year. Their sack total was about the same, 10.5. They had 10 and 11.5 the years prior. But they just did not put pressure on the quarterbacks, whether it's total pressures, pressure rate. It has gone basically in half over the last 2 years. So Clint Sinham has played this position at a high level, was an all ACC player at Virginia, then was a top 45 NFL draft pick, got injured and went into coaching, was a good coach at Virginia the last couple of years. So to steal him from another Power 4 school is a good get for Brett Bielema. But I think it's really interesting. Like, what will his impact be on these guys? Because his job is to get the most out of Seth Coleman and Gabe Jacas and Alec Bryant, because it's the last year of Coleman. Jacas hope it's the last year of him. So you got to get the most out of these guys.
Yeah, you do. And he's been productive, right? As a coach, like he's been able to elevate those guys, and he's been here. It's not, you kind of look at someone like Corey Parker, who's been here since the summer, and everything's kind of late spring, I guess probably is a better way, after spring ball. Clint Sinham's had time to build these relationships with guys, to kind of lay out expectations, help them with little tweaks. You always hear that with new coaches, right? Always help me with this or that, or Charlie Bullen was big on footwork. I think that was the story we heard last spring and into fall. So yeah, I mean, it is Clint Sinham to elevate this group. And you're right, I say that, and I feel bad because Charlie Bullen's very good at this job. But that's a position group that, when we say elevate to the stars of your defense, the stars of your team. You like, there's a lot riding on the coach to come in here and elevate your guys to that level and to make them those all Big Ten candidates. And the expectations haven't really been dulled down at all for this group, right? Brett Bielema doesn't typically take a lot of underclassmen to media days. He took Johnny Newton, obviously. I mean, it's kind of under the radar. Johnny could have come back for this year, right? And obviously he wasn't going to, and there's no reason for him. And Brett Bielema knew that going into the season. He takes Gabe Jacas this year, and even at media day, didn't shy away from it. Said, hey, if he has a year we think he can have, he could be a guy to make that NFL jump next year. They've not dulled this down, and that's a lot for Clint Sinham to, like, certainly you've got to recognize that expectations are very high for your position group, and you need to be able to maximize to get the best out of those guys and to make them the stars of your defense.
All right, let's go to, I mean, do you have a different X factor? Probably go with this guy in the long-term prospect. How about that?
That's right. Yeah.
I will hand you the long-term prospect that people should know, Joe.
It's Joe Barn. It's Joe Barn. He's a guy who, a suburban Chicago kid, kind of ranked, what was he ranked, like?
Outside the top 25, so he didn't get a bunch of buzz in state.
But he's a guy who in the past has gone to Wisconsin, has gone to Iowa, and wrecked you and made your life bad when you played him and you land him. And he's physically very, very imposing. Gabe Jacas told us at media day, that he reminds him a lot of him as a freshman. Joe Barna listed at 6'4", 265 pounds, and is getting buzz. That's the thing. It's not like we're just looking at him like, yeah, I think down the road he could be a guy. He is getting legitimate buzz from the coaching staff, from Brett Bielema, from Clinton Senum, from his teammates. Aaron Henry hyped him up again yesterday when we talked with Aaron.
I'd be shocked if he red shirts, right?
I don't expect him to redshirt. I don't know how much he's going to play, but I expect him to get defensive snaps this season. It'll likely be fewer than 100, barring injury, but I expect to see Joe Barna out there on the football field and giving him a chance to get his feet wet in college football. Because if Gabe Jacas makes that leap next year, Joe Barna could be a guy you're looking at the same way we're talking Alex Bray right now. I think there's a lot to like about him. I remember talking to his high school coach for the Coach Speak stories that we do, and there was some wonder, is he going to be quick enough when he adds the necessary weight? I know you and I talked about it, Jeremy, to stay at outside linebacker, and that seems to be a resounding yes since arriving on campus at Illinois. And he plays with a high motor. He's very tenacious. A lot of the ways we described Alex Bray earlier in this pod kind of fills with how we're talking about Joe Barna. He's just a name to know now, but a name to really, really know in 25 and 26.
Yeah, he's built like Gabe. I mean, you mentioned 6'3", 240, 265 as a freshman, and is just absolutely jacked. Tenacious. I liked his film, and Illinois beat Wisconsin. Wisconsin really wanted him. So even though he's number 35, I believe, in the state, like bigger win than that. So it is really encouraging. The other thing I will mention is it has to be Joe Barna for this conversation, because Mason Moragan is out for the season. And then they lost two of their best prospects, long-term prospects at this position during the offseason. When Calvin Smith transferred to Purdue, he was going to play this year. And for me, he was the heir apparent to Seth Coleman as that speedy, long edge rusher who is adding strength but just needed time to develop. That was a big loss for them long-term, maybe not for this season. But then Josiah Knight was one of my favorite prospects in the class of 2024. Had admissions issues at Illinois, ended up at Mississippi State. Illinois helped in that process. But this is a position that after this year has big questions long-term, because even if Alec Bryant, Daniel Brown, Joe Barna are back, they're bringing in Eric Gale. This is going to be a big portal position, I think, in the offseason. They should have a lot to sell, you would hope. But long-term, this has changed a lot, right? Even though I'm high on Joe Barna and what Alec Bryant could be as a starter next year, they need more talent at this position. So it's even more imperative that they do get a lot out of these guys and get them to the NFL, because they got a lot of talent to replace.
Yeah, this was a position along with running back that in the past we had said I feel best about it short, medium, and long term. Now I feel best about it short term. Illinois, just given the loss of Calvin Smith and the JoJo Knight situation that happened and the admissions issue. So, yeah, that if you've got to go to the portal, it means Gabe Jacas is gone. And if Gabe Jacas is gone, it means you've got a good sell in the portal. And I would assume Seth Coleman's gone no matter what, but I would assume you're probably going to have a good sell with him. So if you've got to go, you've probably got a good sell. But, well, I mean, if to get the production you're going to be in battles, right?
One guy we need to mention now is JoJo Hayden, because he has moved from linebacker to outside linebacker.
And I believe that move over Demetrius John.
Yes, I think this is a legit move. JoJo in high school was a great edge rusher. So he's built more like a Kanena Odeluga, right? He's longer. He's certainly he's like 6'1", 6'2", something like that. But he's an undersized guy, but he's a legit edge speed rusher that I don't know if he's going to make a big impact this year. Aaron Henry seemed to be teasing yesterday that JoJo is really intriguing for them. So I'm not expecting a huge impact this year, but next year wouldn't surprise me if he's in that two deep. I mean, kind of built like Daniel Brown is really kind of what he's built like. So maybe more speed edge rushers, not the length that you'd have ideally, but he's another intriguing guy with maybe a year at practicing at this position. Maybe in 2025, he can make an impact.
Yeah, he's a guy that we talked about a lot. As you mentioned, Kanena Odeluga, that overhang linebacker that has a lot of pass rush quality, pass rush value that you look for in your outside linebackers. Obviously, JoJo Hayden's going to have to spend this year adding strength that would necessitate playing that position, but this isn't a new position to him. He's He's played this in high school, as you mentioned. He's got the tools to get after the passer. So I think there's optimism there, and I think that one is going to stick. It probably, truth be told, well, Brett Bielema said the other day that they did recruit him initially with eyes on that, and then he gets here, and there was a little bit of thin, the inside linebacker group was thin, and he went there. Believe that as you will, but this isn't like a totally, whoa, I can't believe they've done that type move.
But moving Demetrius John and JoJo Hayden shows you how much they needed other options at this position.
Oh, yeah.
Lost. All right, so depth chart, Seth Coleman and Gabe Jacas are the starters. Alec Bryant, rotation guy. It's hard to know with Daniel Brown, but I do think he's such an interesting piece because he's so fast, so quick off the edge, versatile. You'd feel really comfortable dropping him in coverage or getting after the quarterback. So I do think ideally if he's healthy, he would be that fourth option. But if he weren't healthy with that back, however long it lasts, Joe Barna is probably that fourth guy up.
Yeah. It's a lot to put on a freshman. And I don't know the severity, I guess, or the depth of which Daniel Brown is dealing with this back. We haven't seen him in pads the last two practices. We'll see if that changes on Saturday, but how much, if at all, that'll linger.
The one thing I would throw out there, it'd probably be an easy transition if they had to go to an emergency guy for Ezekiel Holmes to go back to outside linebacker, right?
Yeah.
So just an emergency situation, just worth throwing out there. But yeah, then I think JoJo, Demetrius, right, and then walk-ons are that third group. So yeah, Coleman, Bryant, Jacas, Brown, Joe Barna. That's the top right there.
Yeah, and behind that would be Hayden.
Yep. All right, expectations, Joey. What's your expectations for what I would rank right now? Confidence of position groups. This would probably be number one for this season going into this year. I think offensive line still got some question marks. With the two guys in the two starting positions and a proven rotational player, this would probably be my number one position. So what are your expectations for it?
Be the stars. Be the faces of this defense and produce like the faces of this defense. Those Seth Coleman, Gabe Jacas, Alec Bryant last season combined for 10.5 sacks and 7.5, 16.5 tackles for loss. They need to be in that outside linebacker group. You would like to see them in that 13.5, 14.5 sack range, 20-ish tackles for a loss. Like, you need this group to do that. You need them to produce and be disruptive like that.
Outside linebacker group, I love the stat from PFF just because I feel like, sacks can be the difference of
pressures.
A millisecond. But I love pressures. Last year was 49. The years before, 78 and 79. I think you have to push back towards that 75 plus pressures. And secondary will have to play a role in that, right? But they need to consistently get pressure on the quarterbacks between these top three. And as you said, 10.5 sacks between that group last year, that's not enough. They have to get down the quarterback because that changes drives, right? More than allowing him to just throw the ball away. But I think between that 13 to 16 range for these guys, do I expect one guy to have a Whitney Merciless season? No, because that's one of the best seasons I've ever seen in Illinois football history. But as a group, yeah, I want Coleman and Jacas each to have 6+. I expect Alec Bryant to get a couple of them. I don't know if Daniel Brown or Joe Barna or whoever adds another one or two, but I think as a group, it's a realistic goal to get 15 sacks. That's a lot of sacks in college football, but I think that's where they need to be closer to this year.
And they're being presented as a group that is within the realm of possibilities for that. Two guys went to media day. Brett Bielema is making these guys the faces of his Illinois football defense. And with that's the expectation to be guys who are changing games. As we talked about earlier, do you have those game changers on the defensive line as of right now? I would suspect not. So you need them at outside linebacker to be that, to be able to make that quarterback uncomfortable and to replace some of that discomfort, that disruptiveness that you lose with Johnny Newton.
And this all works together, right? If they're getting pressures, Miles Scott, Matthew Bailey, Terrence Brooks, Tyler Strain, Xavier Scott, they're more likely getting takeaways, right? If the defensive line is doing its job and occupying their guys and playing good run defense, it puts, more opportunities to rush the passer with talented edge rushers like this. And if Coleman and Jacas and Bryant are drawing more attention. Maybe Dennis Briggs and Alex Bray get more one-on-one battles to where they can do. So all these guys have to elevate their game, but there's a reason the NFL invests such high picks, such big money into these edge rusher positions, because it's just so impactful. And that's why when you have so many questions on the defensive line and in the secondary, there's a lot of pressure on these guys to take that next step. And I expect them to get better. Can they take it to all Big Ten levels? And if they do, I can believe in this defense. If they stay what they were last year, I think this defense is going to struggle.
I agree with that. Edge rushers, tackles, quarterbacks. Those are, oh God, probably 65% of the first round draft picks, at least in the top half. Like that, those positions can change games in good ways. If your tackles stink, and they're in bad ways if your tackles stink, and in good ways if your edges can get out there and flip games. So yeah, they need this for this defense to go, and probably for this defense or this team to be in bowl contention in November. They need this position, this edge rusher group, to be dominant and to flip games on its head.
All right. Anything else to add here, Joey?
No, I got nothing.
Yeah. So we'll wrap this all up with linebackers and defensive backs. It's a lot to get through tomorrow, because that secondary is going to be really, really intriguing. And catching up with Aaron Henry, it feels like there's a little bit more depth, but we'll break it all down tomorrow. So we appreciate you listening to the Illini Inquirer podcast. Give us a rating, review wherever you get your podcast. Check us out on YouTube. Hit that like button, subscribe to us, and hit the notifications bell. For Joey Wagner, I'm Jeremy Werner. Everybody have a great day. Take care of each other. We'll talk to you next time right here on the Illini Inquirer podcast.